Time for the news of the day. Oh, we got a lot of news to go over today, and also I'm going to present some of the a table that I've been working on. I've been going through GDP across Asia and looking at the impact of COVID on GDP. So let's get started. What we're talking about is news for the day, and if you have any questions, make sure you put them in the chat. I welcome questions on any topics. Questions here. I'll just put that right there. If you've got any questions, make sure to ask. Saying hi to my friends on Facebook and also on YouTube and the other platforms. So here's the chart that I wanted to show. And this chart is one I was just going through. I'm doing some different analysis, and I was just looking at here. You can see that Philippines was hit hardest in Asia. China and Taiwan stayed positive. This is looking at the impact of COVID. We can see it in 2020 that the Philippines contracted by almost 10%. In Thailand, when we went through the 1997 crisis, the contraction in the GDP was 11%. So it is a pretty big move. Now, you also notice that China and Taiwan stayed positive. In fact, they had been performing pretty well in 2019. But if you look at Philippines, India, Hong Kong, and Thailand, they all were contracting or reducing their growth in 2019 already. So it hit pretty hard for Philippines, India, Hong Kong, Thailand, and Malaysia, and even Japan. So let's look at some news. Well, BBC says Tesla will no longer accept Bitcoin over climate concerns. Interesting. Elon Musk causes Bitcoin's price to fall by 10%. Well, Elon Musk tweeted that Tesla will no longer accept Bitcoin transactions as he claims that it's unsustainably uses fossil fuels. Tesla will accept Bitcoin transactions when they become more sustainable. His statement led to about a 10% drop in Bitcoin's price, causing about 365 billion to be wiped off the cryptocurrency markets. Now, cash outflow from Bitcoin could be beneficial for gold. Makes it look like gold's a pretty stunning asset. Now, I saw a couple charts that people put up on Twitter looking at this, and what you can see is the top one shows the blue bar is the estimated annual energy consumption of Bitcoin versus Ethereum versus Tezos. And Tezos basically has almost none. If you look below, we see the same chart, but what's interesting in the chart below is Visa. You can see that per transaction, it's 0.003 versus 250 for the amount of kilowatt hours that are consumed per transaction. And it's really one of the weaknesses of Bitcoin is that it just spends a lot of energy to create the transaction. So that's one of the big hurdles that has to gotten through. So next, the Wall Street Journal shows that Israel begins ground operations against Hamas in Gaza. Now, you have to be very careful here about the news because the news outlets are mainly controlled by the U.S. By U.S. companies, and U.S. companies tend to be influenced by U.S. policy, and so they tend to come on the side of U.S. policy. But the Israeli-Hamas conflict explodes as troops begin to mobilize. Israel and Hamas have fought 3 wars since Hamas seized control of the Gaza Strip in 2007. Israel has amassed up to 4,000 ground troops on the border, and Hamas has fired over 1,750 missiles. So escalated violence between these two countries could lead to a rise in oil price and actually could lead to an all-out war. As fighting intensifies, we can see a rise in oil prices and possibly increased tension between U.S. and Russia. Recent increases in Saudi oil production could help ease the potentially inflated prices. So again, this is, from a humanitarian perspective, nobody likes to see a conflict. From a global perspective, this has a risk that it drives up oil price, and we're already struggling with inflated oil prices. Next, from CNBC, a huge moment. U.S. gives go-ahead for its first major offshore wind farm. It seems kind of strange that the U.S. is just giving out go-ahead for wind farms. We've seen wind farms all around the world. So the U.S. approved the first large-scale wind project on May 11th it approved it. It's known as Vineyard Wind 1 project. In 2020, the U.S.'s wind share of utility scale electricity generation was only about 8.4% compared to 60% for fossil fuel. There is a long way to go for wind. Of course, wind has the problem that if it's not windy, you don't get energy. And then it has the problem of storage. So basically, the approval sets a precedent for the development of future offshore wind farms. U.S. offshore wind industry is still in its infancy, and investments in wind energy stocks could see positive trends in the long term, like General Electric produces turbine, Northland Power, Vestas Wind Systems, some of the companies that could benefit from this. Next is JP Morgan and others plan to issue credit cards to people with no credit scores. Well, we've seen this before when we were giving, when banks started giving mortgage loans, housing loans to companies that didn't have good credit scores. It did go wrong. Let's learn more about this, right? JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, and US Bancorp are collaborating to allow people with no credit to borrow money. For example, JP Morgan might approve a credit card application from a person who has a deposit account at Wells Fargo but doesn't have a credit score. In other words, they're recognizing a deposit account at another bank, and that could give more access to people without money. About 50 million adults in the U.S. don't have a traditional credit score. This removal of barriers could result in increased spending, and this could be an opportunity for banks to gain more customers in the long run. I think really this is a story of kind of accessibility or accessing the bank system. All right, Bloomberg tells us that over 700 barges are stuck in a Mississippi River from a bridge crack. So what do we see? The recent water traffic in the Mississippi River has put a halt on commodity shipments from the U.S. The Mississippi River is the main artery for U.S. crop exports like corn, soy, and wheat. And my goodness, corn is already up so much. Many of these soft commodities are already up a lot, and this just reduces the supply even more. Apart from agricultural products, you've got refined oil and steel are also shipped on the river. And for those people who read the book Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer, it was all about travels up and down the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi River, of course, goes north-south from nearly Canada down to Louisiana. And this used to be the main way of transporting goods throughout America, particularly north to south. The U.S., the global shortage could continue to drive commodity prices up. In our all-weather strategy, we have an overweight position in commodities. This event exacerbates the issues, and things could get worse with scarcity related to crops and raw materials. I give a few ETFs down here. You've got the iShares MSCI Global Agricultural Producers Fund. You've got another one called Tucrium, not sure how to pronounce that, Corn Fund, and United States Oil Fund. So, Colombia protests, shortages in Cali as demonstrations rumble on. Now, you also have to be very careful here because the U.S. tries to manipulate the economies and the political environment of many countries in South America, and Colombia is just one of them. So protests in Colombia is turning into civil unrest. Protests enter their third week for national reforms. Blockades have paralyzed cities such as Cali, causing fuel and food shortages. The UN and EU have expressed concerns over reports of police violence. I have seen some of these pictures where people are blocking off roads. It weakens an already, deteriorating economy. Colombia's petroleum-dependent economy is worsening as only 14 drill rigs are in operation compared to 25 last year. 42.5% of the population is now in poverty compared to 35.7%, which is already massive before the pandemic. This could be a people's protest. Colombia's protest could hinder its post-COVID economic recovery and push it over in the economic crisis. And maybe it turns it into some political crisis. The U.S. housing market is hot, and Canada's is even hotter. Average home price in Canada rose 32% from a year ago. U.S. sales prices increased by about 13% compared to the same period previously. Factors driving prices are tight supply, low borrowing costs is causing more demand, and pandemic-inspired demand for larger homes in both countries is there. Now, Canada could face a market crash eventually. Its faster population expansion, has increased immigration. Canadian investors' confidence is high. So basically, they went through 2008 without much loss. The U.S. real estate market is hot, but less speculative. Lack of supply and a rise in mortgage rates are keys that deter a bubble. And the last story of today, UK wants global deal to stop financing coal projects. The UK aims to reduce global coal for electricity production and reduce carbon emissions. The US EIA expects the US coal production to decrease by 11% in 2021. Independent coal miners could suffer as governments shift away from coal for energy. It could reduce the supply of independent coal producers. And also, it could increase costs to non-integrated steel companies because they need that coal. Vertically integrated steel producers could benefit as they're not affected by coal price fluctuation to as much of an extent. So let's talk about that for a second. There's an interesting company in Russia called Servistol, which we look at a lot in the valuation masterclass. And it's a company that has its own coal and then converts that coal into steel, basically. And that has an advantage in a difficult situation like this. All right, so let's go into some questions. The first question is, do you see inflation being short-term or long-term? I think inflation is going to be long-term. I think we are in an up cycle that could last for 3 to 5 years. What else can benefit from Bitcoin cash outflow event? Well, I'd say commodities are probably another area where money is flowing. So commodities, these commodity ETFs are pretty hot. But I think that, people that are playing in Bitcoin probably are more speculative, and they may go into commodities. It's just hard now that money can't necessarily go into the stock market because the stock market's quite valued, quite highly valued. Mike, what's your thoughts on pipeline company paying the ransom? Will this just encourage cyber attacks? Well, I totally, disagree with paying ransom, but sometimes, you're literally being held by ransom. I'm just surprised in this day and age with such a public company that they could do that. It also reminds you that, maybe it's time to go back to real fail-safes where real people have to man the pipeline to some extent, and they can get out and manually override the electronic systems. And I think that that's a lesson that we're learning, that we can't totally rely on new age technology. Suchai says, what were the main factors that resulted in Philippines' highest GDP contraction? Well, I think the first thing is the government didn't come and spend. There just wasn't any government support, number one. Number two, they weren't doing much exporting, and so they didn't get some benefit of being an exporter. And so all that was left was really consumption. Remember that Philippines shut down a lot too compared to other countries, and they had a worse showing on the COVID situation. Next question. What's the best book to read about investing? That's a good question. This is a good book to read about investing. The Elements of Investing. Burton McKeel and also Charlie Ellis. This is a great book, very small, but it gives you a lot of the foundations about investing. All right, next. Can civil unrest impact oil prices? Definitely. And I think that we are seeing unrest happening in the Middle East right now, and particularly with Israel and Gaza, and who knows how else that could go, but that could stir up oil prices. Manling says, can the global commodity shortage be addressed as soon as possible? I think it's going to take time because I think a lot of demand has been shut down, and I just see that it's just hard. Now, I think that also we have to be careful not to over-exaggerate the Colonial Pipeline shutdown. That doesn't mean that is a temporary supply constraint that I think they're going to reverse pretty quickly. So I would say that it's going to be hard to reverse inflation. I think we've got it for a while. All right, next question. Titigon says, do you think the act of moving towards clean energy will impact inflation? Of course it will. In fact, I actually believe that we won't move towards clean energy anywhere like what people think. It's a lot of talk and everybody's talking about it, but how many people are leaving their cars at home and walking in or taking public transport? The majority of people that are saying we got to move to clean energy, they're not even doing that. How many people are not traveling rather than taking that airplane flight? Certainly the rich aren't. They're still traveling in their uh, fancy planes and all that. But what I would say about clean energy is we know it's expensive. We have not hit economies of scale, for instance, with solar. So the result is, how could it be cheaper than oil if you know it's so expensive? The other thing is that we just had to have oil prices super high, and then we would see less of an impact coming from green energy. Matab says, do you think a housing sector bubble is building? Is it going to burst? Definitely, housing sector is at risk. In fact, one of my nieces just bought a house in Michigan, and she financed it for less than 3% at a fixed 3%. Let's just say 4%. She got a fixed 4% for 30 years. Who can not borrow with that? If you can get those kind of terms, I have to admit, I think almost anybody would borrow. And so you see a lot of borrowing. And so I think that the housing sector does have some signs of a bubble. And it really comes from now, also remember that almost all of that low cost borrowing is being subsidized by the US government. First, by keeping interest rates low. Second, by allowing tax deductions related to homeowners. And third, remember who's buying these home loans. When a bank issues a fixed home loan, they can't keep that on their balance sheet because their cost of funds are going to be rising and they'd be squeezed. So they're selling it to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and that's where it's going. And that's where the problem was in the last crisis, and I think we'll have it there. When Doug Ann says, do you think the trade tension of U.S. and Australia plus U.S. reducing coal output could send the coal price to hike and that go along with it global inflation? Yes, definitely. I think there's a lot of tension in the world, and the tension in particular in coal and trying to shift towards green energy and all that. I think that there is a risk that the cost and the regulatory cost, the political costs of coal could drive up inflation. All right, Arab countries are supporting a ceasefire, but Israel has yet to comply. What are your thoughts on the U.S. relation to this response? Personally, I think that the U.S. is so biased behind Israel that it's just almost impossible for them to objectively look at it. And so almost everything they say is pro-Israel and, anti-Palestinian. And that's no way to get to some sort of resolution. That's ultimately what we want to see. I want to see a reduction in tensions. And that would mean that America has to back away a little bit. But I don't think that that's going to happen in relation to Israel. All right, those are the questions for the day. I'm just going to go back to the graphic, which you can see that I showed today. This is the graphic about GDP across Asia, and you can get a picture of what the situation is like in all these different countries. So Philippines was the worst, and China and Taiwan did the best. All right, I think that's it for today. I just want to thank you all for attending, and I want to let you know that I appreciate all the questions and comments that you send, and I hope that you have an amazing weekend ahead.